Okay, so welcome. Officially getting things going now on diver leader development. So this is an extracurricular session aimed at dive leaders, but hopefully is going to be useful for everybody. And this is all about planning a diving day. So what do we mean by this? So what are we going to include today? So we're going to cover things like why should you bother doing it in the first place? Why bother putting your neck on the line and doing these things? We'll be talking about what you should plan. So we'll talk about some methodologies like who, what, where, when, how, and we'll talk through a few examples. So we'll build it up progressively. So we'll talk through some inland and then ocean diving and then building it up all the way to boat diving in the end. So what should you know already? Well, hopefully we're going to assume some knowledge and it will the knowledge that we're assuming that you've got, but it's not the end of the world if you don't, is DT1 and DT8. These are both dive leader theory sessions, and we'll include a lot more detail on some of the things we'll just be recapping. Now, quick poll. I would like to know, before we start this session, what sort of planning you guys have done already. So if, hold on, I need to move the poll on, don't I? Aha, there we go. Yeah, so I'd like to know what sort of planning you guys have done already. So if you head over to that poll, you should be able to choose more than one option, actually, if you want to, and tell us what sort of experiences you've had. Now, I'm expecting that there'll be lots of people, well, hopefully everyone will have done a personal dive plan, but it'll be interesting to see what other types of planning that you guys have, you folk have done out there. And it looks like that's the case. So yes, everybody seems to have done their personal plans. And then a fair few of you have done some shore diving and trips to places like to places like Vobster and Stony, which is really good to see. I'd be curious to see whether or not you've used some of the methodologies that we're going to talk about tonight. And then there's 7 of you who are really clever clogs who've done multi-day international trips, which is pretty impressive. So kudos to you guys for doing that. So let's crack on and talk about why should I. So hopefully most of you are well on your way to a dive leader qualification. And part of that is leadership. Yeah. So this is your opportunity to push diving in the right direction, to take a leadership role within your branch. It gives you a bit more control as well. You can propose and plan the sort of diving that you want to do. You're not always stuck doing the diving that Bob, who's on the committee of your branch, wants to do. You can sort, take matters into your own hands, for the lack of a better term. You get lots of experience when you're doing planning. I've found that for certain. It's not just experience in diving. It's actually a life skill. Is this detailed type of planning that we're trying to talk about tonight. And the other thing is that you're contributing to the diving community. You're lightening the load for the club and the committees, and also you'll be showing others within your branch how it's done. I'm for those of you who sat through our session on dive leader and the role in the community. We're really serious at Reading and at Southampton, which was the guys who presented it, about a dive leader's role in the community, and dive planning's I think quite a key part of that. So please do consider taking these skills forward and using them. Now, one of the reasons why we did this session is because we had a lot of questions throughout the dive leader course with regards to what people can and can't do with regards to planning. So I just thought it's useful to highlight the Safe Diving Guide, which is a book, or you can find it online. I'll see if I can find a link to it that I can share with you. And it's guidance that shows all of the that tells you all of the that you need to know in order to plan diving safely. There we go. There's the link if you want to head to it. And what the safe diving guide tells you is that authorized branch dives, they need to be approved by your club's diving officer. That's true. And any dive leader or above can be a dive manager. It doesn't mean that I know that some clubs like to impose extra rules and things like that, but by the letter of the BSAC law, you don't need to be an advanced diver to be a dive manager or anything like that. So this is just to highlight exactly what you can and cannot do. Now, as with everything, experience is important, and just because you can doesn't mean you necessarily should. What I'd recommend is that you start progressively. So if you haven't done any sort of planning at all, then start simple. So maybe have a look at doing planning a day out at a quarry. You know, we're all going to go to ANNEX when it opens, or whatever, and then build up to slightly more complicated days out. You know, start maybe liaising with a hard boat skipper, and then eventually build up to, you know, maybe taking the club rib out. So gain that experience. And the other thing that you can do is there's going to be probably a lot of knowledge and experience in the people in your club. So you should really take the opportunity whenever it's there to try and absorb that and to share and pass it on yourselves. Now, a quick note on this right at the start: please don't get complacent with dive planning. What we'll be teaching you today is some tools and methods, and there's an option if you want them at the end. I'll throw out a couple of templates and things. But what this doesn't mean is that you should just recycle plans. You need to be thinking about each day when you're going out diving. You need to plan for that exact day. Every day is going to be slightly different, so generic plans are not very suitable for diving as safely as you possibly can. And also, those plans that you put in place, it's great if you plan a week or 2 weeks in advance. That's absolutely fine, but you need to make sure that the plan is updated as the situation develops. So you might find that the weather changes, or the participants of that dive that you're planning change. So yeah, please do keep on top of those things. Now, do you want to head back to the poll and let's see what you think about this next question? Where are we at? Poll question 3. So you should be able to see that now. And it's a dive plan. What does it do? Does it keep things running on time? Does it share the load? Does it help keep things safe? Does it guarantee everyone's having a good time? Does it help in an emergency? Does it keep your diving officer informed? And does it stop the unexpected happening? I'm just going to copy and paste that link again for anyone who hasn't got access to the poll. All right, we're getting a lot of votes in already, which is really good to see. Oh, there we go. I've hidden the answers so that you don't get influenced. So there's 5 people there that are possibly not correct, eh? Well, let's have a look at the answers. If you've not voted by now, then you need to vote faster next time. So here we go. So let's see what everyone thinks. So yeah, everyone agrees that it helps keep things safe. It definitely can help in an emergency, and we'll talk about how later on. It helps keep your dive officer informed. It does share the load, and it does help keep things running on time. But for those of you who says it guarantees a good time's had by all and it stops the unexpected from happening, it doesn't. It'll help to keep people having a good time, hopefully. And if the unexpected happens, it'll help to cope with that. That's the point of the dive plan. So, so well done, guys. Let's head back to the slides. So let's start with the basics of a dive plan. And it's nice and simple. You should be able to see it on the screen in front of you there, the who, what, where, when, and how, why. Well, we know the why. We've already covered the why. So let's start with the who. So the who is your list of divers. So it's all very straightforward, isn't it? You want to know the divers and some information about them. The what? Well, that's the type of diving that we're going to be doing. So whether we're going on a boat, where we're going on the boat, and that sort of thing, and whereabouts we're heading to with that. We'll also be planning the timings. So what's happening when people turning up, what's happening throughout the day, and then we'll also be looking at the logistics. So that's your hows. So that's how you get there, what equipment you need, and how we're going to keep things safe. So let's start out with The Who, not the band The Who. In this case, the band is the Rolling Stones. And I would like to know, for those of you who've got access to the chat, if you want to drop in, what information would you ask of the people when you're trying to formulate a dive plan? What sort of information do you think we would need? Obviously, we've got their name, and let's assume that we know, because they're part of our club, that they are one of our club members, so they're a BSAC diver. Here we go. We've got some answers coming in now. So Dave says skills level, experience coming from lots of people, qualification, medical conditions are coming in. Yeah. Vivian's made a good point of what are they interested in. And last time they dived, kit changes, lots of useful stuff coming in. So let's have a look. These are the things that I'd come up with. So we've got dive leader level. So yeah, what qualification have we got? I don't think, oh, we've had someone mention emergency contacts. One thing that I like to keep track of is contact details for the person themselves, just in case you need to get hold of them. And then, yeah, like Ben had said, the next of kin details, so who they are and how we get hold of them, that's really important. And then I think somewhere further up, someone had also mentioned what they're going to be doing. So we've got Mick is going to be the dive manager, because he's the more experienced person in this pair, and together they're going to be fun diving. Now, should really Mick and Keith just go out diving on their own, or is there anyone else that we should be thinking of in this diving group? Aha, Ben was quick off the mark there. Yeah, so shore cover. So what about let's get Charlie involved. So here's Charlie. He's going to be the assistant dive manager, and he's going to act as surface cover. Now, when you're collecting all of this information, don't forget, like someone pointed out earlier, check fitness to dive. That's especially important right now, because the medical form that we all fill out that says how fit we are to dive, that is a changing thing. So that every time you have an illness or you hurt yourself or something like that, you really should be revisiting that form and checking that nothing has changed that will prevent you from diving. So if you, Ken's asking, would you be made aware of any medical conditions beforehand? So as part of the dive planning, you can ask people if you have a planning session at your club, or if you do it online. Some people do. It's worth asking the question: anyone got any medical conditions that they need to think about? Everyone fit and healthy, and then you should be asking the same thing again as a dive manager at the start of the day: is everyone fit and healthy? That's part of the seeds brief that you do. So let's talk about the where. So as dive leaders, hopefully you know this. Wherever you plan a dive, it needs to be a location known to the branch. Okay, if it's an unknown location or it's a new location for the branch, that puts it in the under the auspices of an advanced diver or above. So for you guys, it needs to be location known to the branch, and it needs to be suitable for the divers that you're taking, and it needs to be suitable for the activity. So we've got here some more details. So we've got Mick and Keith. We already know their qualifications, but let's have a look. So we know that Mick and Keith have progressed to 45 and 35 meters, and they are proposing a dive to the Salsette. Now, looking at that on the face of it, no, it's not suitable. It's 48 meters, so we need to make sure that where we're planning for is a reasonable place to dive. So somewhere that might cover both of them. Let's take it really simple. At Stony Cove, that's a nice easy one. Ben's asking, does a known site mean a specific wreck that's been dived before, or could it be a location that's dived before? Well, that's a tough question. A known site would the latter might not be classed as a known site. You'd have to check with your diving officer, who would have the ultimate say on that. If you've got two locations that are right next to each other, you know, like you've got, for instance, like Valentine tanks, then diving on the first tank and then the second tank, and that might be all right. But if they're further apart, some people may feel that that's requires additional planning or an advanced diver to plan it. It's a diving officer sort of level of decision, so you'd need to defer to them. So where? So in this case, let's look at Stony Cove. So in your plan, you're going to talk about where you're going. So Stony Cove, we might put the address in, just in case. Everyone should know where Stony Cove is anyway. And then let's have a look at when. So this is where people start to get their sort of their head wrecked a little bit when they try to work out the timings of a day. So what I'd like you guys to do is, if you can throw into the chat some of the timings. So what sort of points, what points are we wanting to set times for in the day? Now, I'll give you a starter for 10. Obviously, we've got arrival and opening. So I'd say, you know, so if Stony Cove opens up at 8:30, oops, my thing's sliding, 8:30, then we want to maybe arrive for 8 o'clock. Okay. What else are we looking for? So here we go. We've got Nick saying briefing and kit up. We've got time for lunch. Oh, it's very generous saying time for lunch. We've got, yeah, in water time, first dive, considering dive time. Some really good some really good answers here. So one that I've got here, yeah, it's a dive site where you do need to check in. So yeah, we've got to check in. So we might do, say, you know, 8:30 until I don't know, once you've built your kit, should we say 10 o'clock? So there's a bit more of a plan. BST, bacon sarnie time, is very important. That you can probably throw that in there. So if we have bacon sarnie time, BST, and we'll call that 30 minutes. And then we do our briefing. Maybe we can do our briefing at the same time as bacon sarnie time. So let's say the brief starts at 10:30. And then it's going to last 15 minutes max. So that's 10:45, isn't it? So you can see how we're already beginning to form a timeline. Next thing, kitting up and buddy checks. So how long should that take? Depends on the people, doesn't it? This is something that you'd need to think about. If you're diving with a load of first-class divers, their kit's probably already built and prepared, and they're all on rebreathers that they've, you know, had assembled at 6 a.m. in the car park. But if you're diving with a load of novice ocean divers, then kitting up and buddy checks might take an hour. But let's call it half an hour. Yeah, kit up and buddy checks, and so that's 10:45 until 11:15. Okay, so we've got a bit of a timeline, and then we start to get into the water. What I've said there, I've written over it, haven't I? What an idiot. Remember to leave plenty of slack. What I mean by slack is a sort of project management type term. It means give yourself a bit of wiggle room. You know, like Scotty in Star Trek, always quote a bit longer. Okay, as Ben says there, faff factor. So yeah, make sure you're accounting for that. So wait a minute, what did we? 11:15. So let's have a look. So 11:15, we're getting in the water, aren't we? And then how long are we going to dive for? Well, again, it really depends, doesn't it? This is where you need to be thinking about who's diving and what they're diving for. If you're diving with a load of rebreather divers, then you know you're out at about 1600, aren't you? Because they've all gone down and then hovered horizontally for their entire dive and looked at nothing. But realistically, it really depends. Let's say that we're just going out for a bit of a pootle around the bottom of Stony Cove, so we're going to be in there for 45 minutes. So that gets us out of the water at noon in time for a bacon sandwich or whatever it is that you're going for. So we need to get out the water. So let's say it takes us 10 minutes to swim back to the exit point. So 12:10. And then de-kit and change. Well, I'm quite generous. This is assuming it's a one dive day. So let's say you've got a full hour to get out your wet things. So 13:10. Then what are we looking at? Well, we should always have a debrief. If you're a dive leader, or you know, if you if you're a dive leader, then you should probably do a debrief just before you change, just so you cover the important things. But then you've got a day debrief, which you should be doing. So let's do the day debrief. Make sure you tell everyone what time to appear where. So we've got, say, let's say 13, keep it simple, 13:15 for the day debrief, 13:30 finish. It's a brief, it should only be short. And then pack up and leave. Well, yeah, who cares? Take as long as you like if it's the end of the day. Now, if you're planning an overnight stay, you might start to continue, say hotel and dinner and all of that sort of stuff in your final debrief of the day. We're all going to meet at the Fox and Hounds or whatever. So all sorts of things to consider there. Now that's quite a simple plan, isn't it? But you can see how it can get a lot more complicated. And as soon as you start trying to get more than one thing in that diving day, or you have something go slightly awry, then it makes it quite challenging to shuffle all those numbers around. Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to do it. So in this example, how do we get there? So this is a simple plan. Let's make our way in our own cars. Nice and straightforward. It's an inland dive site, doesn't need a boat. How do we organise ourselves? Well, let's meet in the queue. And if we can't find ourselves in the queue, we'll ring each other. And then how do we dive? So all the divers are responsible for their own kit. Keeps that nice and simple, doesn't it? We'll follow the site guidance. So we'll do what the fellas at Stony Cove tell us, and we'll dive in pairs to make sure that we're nice and safe. How else do we dive safely? As mentioned, we've got Charlie as surface cover. Duncan's mentioned a WhatsApp group for all divers. They're quite useful. Yeah, you can set up a WhatsApp group or a Facebook Messenger group or whatever, so you can all communicate in a little group for that day, which is a good thing to do. So we've got ourselves a simple plan here. So we've got at the top, we've got our divers. We've got the details there that we can get hold of them. We've got their next of kin and all of that jazz. We've got a basic dive plan of what they're up to. We've got where they're going to, and then we've got all of those timings. So I've just condensed those down. And then we've got details on travel, equipment, and safety. Now, question for you guys in the chat. Okay, was that enough information? Is that plan enough to conduct the day? What do you think? We've got a load of information there. Is that enough? Steve tells me it's not. James says no emergency planning. There's nothing mentioned about emergency kit. Lots of what if factor sort of statements. Yeah. Okay, so my answer is this is probably about enough to do the day, but barely. It's barely enough. So what could you add? And lots of people have already coming up with some great ideas. So gas planning, emergency kit, safety information, weather, Steve's mentioned, and Sarah. You might not. I mean, weather might not be a consideration for Stony Cove as much as it if you were diving on the coast, but it is important to consider. But basically, yeah, we could have just loads more detail, couldn't we? So let's try something a little bit more challenging. Okay, it's the next step up, or at least to me, it's the next step up from diving at an inland dive site. Let's head out to the ocean. And for those of you unlucky enough to have sat through my sessions before, you know that I use Chesil Cove, Chesil Beach as an example a lot of times because it's an easy one and it's a hard one at the same time. So when we're diving from the shore in the ocean, there's a few more considerations that we need to make, and a few of them have already been mentioned in the chat. So ones that I think we should probably talk about, we've got weather. And the weather ultimately influences the sea state. Other things, we've got the tides and currents. We've got logistics, which are a whole lot more challenging. And then, very important, coping with emergencies, which is a bigger challenge. Now, when you're at an inland dive site, the official letter of the law is that you should have the equipment to cope with your own emergencies. But we all know that places like Stony Cove and Vobster and so on will have a rescue boat to hand and will have oxygen and stuff. But that doesn't mean to say you should gamble on it being available when you need it. So first thing, let's talk about planning around weather and the sea state. So we should have already covered this a little bit in Sports Diver, actually, a few of these things. But let's talk about some considerations. So firstly, a lot of people forget about surface visibility. So what a bit of wind and rain can do to surface visibility is quite profound, and it means that you can't be seen necessarily from the shore. So that's quite important. We've also got the weather can impact on the sea state. So if you've got wind suddenly picking up, then you can get bigger waves. It can make foam, just fog and foam, as Tony mentions. And then we've got things like comfort. So this is not just the comfort of the divers, but also potentially comfort of the people who are watching over them. So the surface cover, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I've got some examples. Here's Chesil again. So this is it on a perfectly calm day. Well, it's not quite perfectly calm. There are small ripples there, aren't there? But you can see that's a pretty decent day. But you can what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that over the course of a few hours, the weather can change quite drastically. So now you can see the wind's picked up, the weather's making some waves. Now, depending on the location, that might be absolutely fine. But at Chesil, that's a bit of a nightmare getting in and out. And then look what's happened here. As the weather's gone a little bit grotty, you see the colour of the sea has changed to quite a significant murky colour, which means the visibility will be next to nil. Probably not worth getting into the water there. And then it's really, really picking up there. And actually, you can see just at the bottom of the cove there, it's the winds and the waves have been sufficient enough to tear up a section of seaweed or kelp there. Which gives you an indication of just how rough that can be. So yeah, when you look at it a little bit closer up, you can see that the difference can be quite startling. Now, I wouldn't like to be trying to get in and out of Chesil Cove when the waves are like that. It would be an absolute washing machine. So these are things that you really do need to take into account. So where can we find information on planning around the weather and sea state? Well, one area that you should all be familiar with is just if you've been hanging around in Britain long enough is we've got the Met Office or similar, BBC News, things like that, and they'll give you a very simple synoptic sort of a view of it like this, and you can use it to identify some things that might not be great for diving. So looking at this, I identified straight away, look at that, it's going to be pouring down with rain at one point and we've got fog at another point. Both of which, if you're diving in the sea, are a bit of a no-no. It's going to really, really reduce that surface visibility. So other options that are available, as Duncan says, just go to Vobster instead, have a backup. We'll cover backups later on. As Tony mentioned in the chat there, we've got websites and apps. So we've got Wind Guru, which looks a bit like that. And we've also got Windy. Now, I think if I am on top of my game tonight, I should have those available. There we go. So here's Wind Guru. And it's loading up fresh there. Core blimey. I tell you what, you would not want to be diving in in Swanage over the next few days. If you can see there, lots and lots of purples. I've not seen it that purple for quite a while. That means it's really breezy. So wind gusting 47 knots on Thursday there, 50 knots in fact, and a sustained breeze of 30. That's really, really heavy. Otherwise, you've also got windy. This is what windy looks like. Windy's a little bit fancier. I don't know if you'll be able to see the animations, but it's showing you the little wind icons. If we move it over to Thursday, oh yeah, look, you see it's gone pretty brutal there, hasn't it? So we could use that to plan a little bit. I mean, I would just be staying out the water full stop, but you might say, well, instead of diving here where the wind's going to be coming straight in and presumably the waves, I might be diving on the leeward side of Portland, where it's a bit more sheltered, or maybe in the actual harbour here. So that's an option. And as someone's mentioned, Colm's mentioned, you can always check the live webcams. Yes, there's lots of useful webcams out there that you can check the sea state on. So yeah, pretty useful stuff. Other things, more traditional for those of you who like to wear cable knit sweaters, we've got the shipping forecast. And you can listen there, but that obviously requires some knowledge of what all of those things that they say. You know, it's like a secret code, isn't it? Unless you know what they're talking about, it's quite hard to determine what actually they mean. But as a general rule, because this is something we get asked about relatively often, what constitutes diveable and what constitutes not diveable? Well, it really depends on the location that you're going to be in. But as a general rule, I'd say try and avoid force 4 or above, unless you're with some super experienced people who are used to diving that, or you're potentially diving somewhere sheltered that isn't going to be bearing the brunt of that weather. So we talked about the wind and the waves. Other things that are that we need to consider are the tides and currents. Now, this shouldn't come as a great shock to you. It's been covered probably to death already, but I love an animation, so I made one. And we need to consider things like depth. So let's take, for instance, you're planning a diving day, and if you've not done it quite right, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to take a load of ocean divers out to go and dive this shipwreck. And the shipwreck is, at low tide, it's at 20 meters, which is just about all right. You know, your ocean divers can swim around the conning tower, and maybe your sports divers and above can do a bit more advanced, deeper diving. But what if you get your timings wrong? Well, as the day progresses, the sun starts to move around, tide starts to go up, and then you are out of luck, because now you can easily put 6 meters of water on top of that wreck, which suddenly puts it completely out of range, or at least all the useful stuff out of range for all of your more novice divers, or the divers who've got depth limitations, or maybe it's other limitations. So things like the gas that people are taking out. You know, some nitrox mixers will have a maximum operating depth which isn't suitable for that deep. Well, 26 probably a bad example, but yeah, MODs are important to bear in mind. Now, with the tide, as I'm sure most of you will remember, as the tide moves about, it takes the water with it, and that will mean currents. So you need to plan around those currents. Okay. And just remember that when you're planning around currents, high water and low water doesn't just automatically mean that's when the slack water is. It can be a little bit confusing, so you need to make sure that you are reading the tide tables and stuff properly. And we'll cover that in just a minute. I'm not going to teach you how to read them, but I'm just going to highlight other things that might bear in mind. Visibility, yeah. So oceans, you know, if you're diving in an estuary, for example, the ocean will bring in more clean water. So when the tide's coming in, it's on its flood, you're going to have a cleaner visibility than if you were diving on the ebb, when all the estuary water is then passing over you. So all of these things are going to have an impact on your schedule. So it's really important that you do plan around them. So as Ben's mentioned, you can get information from the Tidal Atlas. Any other people out there with ideas of where we can get some information from? I think I might have already given you a clue, because I think I said one of them already. Vivian says the charts. I'm guessing you mean you're talking about the Admiralty charts and leisure charts and stuff like that. Someone said experienced club members. That's not an answer I was expecting, but it's absolutely spot on. Yes. Local knowledge is good. So yeah, asking people, you know, skippers and such is also useful. Roy says Navonics or Navonics. Yes, that's all useful. Apparently magic seaweed. And Google, yeah, just Google it. That's a great answer from Colin. So officially, let's teach some official ones. Charts and tide tables. fairly unambiguous, these. They do require a bit of skill in working out what they mean. But you can see that those tide tables there, they apply to certain areas. You've got A, B, and C, those tidal diamonds. They'll apply to certain areas on an Admiralty chart. So they will give you details about what's happening on different areas. And you can see that they're subtly different, each of those columns. So they are quite useful, and they'll tell you when water's moving around in springs and in neaps. So big tides and little tides. Otherwise, yeah, if you go on Google, Met Office or similar, so BBC Weather will come up. And I use the BBC Weather to eyeball the tide quite a lot if you're diving somewhere sheltered. So diving, say, Lulworth Cove, where you're not going to get much of a current, but you do want to know how much water you've got. This is ideal. It's really simple, nice and visual, isn't it? Otherwise, we've got good old Wind Guru, which tells us, and a few other websites will tell you. Some people have mentioned local sources. So yeah, great stuff. Now let's talk about logistics. So loads of stuff to consider on logistics. So we've got getting there and back. Now, there's probably a fair proportion of you guys out there that are independently mobile individuals. But I know I speak because I teach for a university club. I know that a lot of our members don't have the luxury of having a car. So organising getting people there and back can be quite a challenge, especially COVID now. We can't necessarily get in the same car, or we might not be able to get a minibus and things like that. Then we've got getting hold of equipment and transporting it there. So, you know, we're lucky that we've got access to vans and trucks and things in my club. You might not have the ability to carry around what looks like about 20 odd tanks there. So that's something to think about. Vivian has messaged me to say parking close enough to the dive site to get kit there. So yeah, parking is quite important. Sometimes there's certain places, like going back to the Chesil Cove, for example, that parking at Chesil Cove is at a premium. So actually getting a spot near enough is really challenging. Sometimes you have to sort of dump the kit and then go and park miles away, which might mean also you have to think about getting to the shore. So we're going to need things like you know, a little trolley or one of those little folding sack trucks and things like that. And then, as some of you have mentioned earlier on, I think for other reasons, we also need to think about amenities. So we want to be responsible adults. So going and relieving yourself against the wall isn't necessarily the right thing to do. So planning around that is quite important. Amenities also includes things like food and drink. So is there somewhere that you can get hot drinks, or do we need to think about taking thermos with us? And then really importantly, the emergency kits. So support equipment. So we've got the emergency kit and we've got backup kit, which we will talk about in a minute. But before that, let's head back to the quiz. And I want to ask you guys which of the following is true about support equipment. So you want to make sure you pack the same kit every time. It should meet requirements of the dive being conducted. O2 should cover the worst case scenario, and you should rely on charters and dive centres to have it all covered. So let's see what people are saying. I can bring it up. No, that's windy. There it is. All right, so we've got quite a powerful consensus there, haven't we? So we've got 40 odd people saying one thing, 29 saying another. Let's see what they have been saying. So it should meet the requirements of the dives being conducted. Absolutely correct. Yeah, so what you pack should meet the requirements, and that's almost flies in the face of the first point, which was make sure you pack the same kit every time. 5 of you said that. I can understand why you might pack the same kit every time, but actually you need to think about, is that kit going to be good enough for what we need? If it's more than good enough, then fair enough. But we need to have a think about that. And what I'm trying to do is avoid people getting into the trap of complacency and not really thinking about these things. 30 of you said O2 should cover the worst case scenario. 30 of you are correct, which means then theoretically that 20 of you didn't answer that correctly. Yeah, O2 should always cover the worst case scenario. You should always have enough oxygen to deal with the incidents that you've got that might happen. So yeah, that's great. So that's it for the polls today. Let's go back and crack on and talk a little bit more about surface support. So I've got another fantastic quote from Safe Diving, which is having a dedicated surface cover means that an incident is more likely to be spotted quickly and help may be quicker to arrive. So it's really important. Now, there are some considerations that you need to make with surface cover. So firstly, think about the jobs that you're expecting them to do. If they're just going to be sitting like Bernie Sanders and just watching over you, then yeah, one person might be enough. Or if they're going to be running around and helping out and doing all sorts of things and being a general facilitator, are there enough people to do that safely? Or are they going to be pulled in too many different directions to keep an eye on all the divers at once? Is that person or are those people experienced and are they equipped for the conditions? So there's lots of things to think about there. If you've got relatively newly qualified dive managers, are they going to be, or assistant dive managers even, are they going to be able to effect a rescue if in really challenging conditions like big waves or things like that? And also, are they equipped for the conditions? So that might be, have they got the right emergency equipment? And also, are they going to be comfortable themselves sitting down for an hour in the pouring rain? Isn't necessarily going to be amenable to a good observation. So things like, have they got an umbrella, keep the rain off their spectacles, and then, yeah, as I mentioned, emergency situations. Have you got everything that you need? Do you have enough of it? So have you got enough oxygen? Have you got enough bandages and things like that? And do those people that have turned up, do they know the emergency plan that we will talk about shortly? It's no good them being there and then not being able to effect that plan. So let's talk about surface support equipment. So my advice to you is when you're trying to work out what you need, just start jotting things down in a list. Okay. Now I tend to sort of clump things into a few categories. The first one, the most important one, is safety. So what do we need for emergencies? Well, obviously, first aid kit, and we also need oxygen. Now, those considerations with oxygen, the capacity, is it big enough for what you're trying to do? So, as a rule of thumb, what I'd say is it needs to be enough for at least 2 divers for as long as it takes to get them to help. So, if you're diving on an offshore, you're going to obviously need a much bigger tank than if you were diving, on the coast somewhere near Plymouth, where there's a decompression chamber really close by. Other than that, what else do you need for an emergency? Well, you need method for calling assistance. So first best method, radio, because it's pretty reliable. And then mobile phone as your sort of backup. Because obviously we know that mobile phone signal can be interrupted quite easily. It's not always available. So yeah, having a radio helps mitigate that risk. Other equipment. So another category that I talk about is the backup category. So what do we include in that? So we've got Save a Dive kits. Now, Save a Dive kits, some of you might be familiar, some of you might not. Usually it's a sort of small toolbox or sometimes margarine tub. It's filled with all the odds and sods that you would need to fix a bit of equipment in the field. The most important bit in the Save a Dive kit, cable ties, isn't it? But you might find, DIN adapters in there, silicon lube, all sorts of stuff. I think, in fact, that there are 1 or 2 sessions on the complimentary webinars on the BSAC website about what you might want to include in your Save a Dive kit. We've also got backup equipment. So when we go diving with my club, we tend to take a set of regs, a set of fins, a spare BC, and a set of weight belts, just in case anyone's kit goes kaput or that they forget something. And as for weights, obviously spare weights to cover an entire person who might have left their weight belt lying on the ground outside the equipment store before you drove off, which we've had numerous times. But also clip-on weights like the one pictured there are really useful if you've got surface cover. You know, if you're trying to descend and then you've put on a bit too much weight over winter or something like that, you're not getting down. It's useful to have clip-on weights rather than having to completely undo your weight belt in the water and put it back on again. So making that equipment list. So here's an example of one off a project dive that I was looking at a while ago. So we've got some equipment we've got equipment for the boat, we've got equipment for a project there, so how we do a jack stay, and then we've got personal equipment, so listing what sort of things. So that's a good idea to do. So that's what that sort of thing looks like. Now, I sort of crowbarred this in as part of equipment. And the reason why I talk about records as part of equipment is because they are, in my mind, they are a little bit of equipment. We're not going to get too much into recording because that's covered in other sessions. But what I mean by this is don't forget that when you're planning stuff, you need to make sure you've got all the infrastructure and all the tools available for you to manage the dive properly. So having a diving record slate is quite important. So don't forget to pack that. So make sure that's included in your list. Okay, if you're not familiar with one of those yet, that's what one looks like. It's not the official BSAC one. I couldn't find a picture of the official BSAC one. That's one that I use. I print it out each time. So we've talked about diving with dedicated surface support. Now, something to think about, especially when we've got limitations right now, which is that you can only meet one other person, is diving without dedicated surface support. Can we do it? Well, here's some quotes from the Safe Diving Guidance. And that is, in some circumstances, it may not be practical to provide dedicated surface cover. If you're the dive manager, you should think carefully about whether or not you need surface cover, and if so, what form it should take. Now, we don't have official guidance on ways around that or what you should do, because each case is going to be unique. But what I can do is give you some thoughts about it. So what you might be able to do. Now, the first thing that you need to bear in mind is competency. The dive manager, in that case, even if you've not got surface support, the dive manager, which you should always have, must be highly competent. And it's also important that the other diver's abilities and the conditions you're diving in are considered and are appropriate to diving without surface support. Now, you could put in place some additional safety mitigations. So you should always be diving somewhere nice and safe if you aren't diving with surface support. But you could try things like start and end of day reporting, so ringing someone up, or you could take it to the next level and you could actually telephone, you could have someone acting as if they were like your surface support with the slate and everything. And you could phone them as soon as you're about to go into the water and as soon as you get back out the water, or you message them or whatever. So these aren't going to make things any safer per se. They're just mitigations for if something does go wrong. So let's just have a quick think about when we could use that remote surface support, so dialing in and things like that. So when might it be suitable? So like Vivian's just messaged me to say familiar shore dive. Potentially, yes. That's a sometimes I've got on that slate there. Things where it could be used, known inland dedicated dive sites. So, somewhere like Stony Cove or wherever, that's a potential. Where there's lots of other divers in the water, that's also a potential, because you could always strong arm someone into being your surface cover, couldn't you? And then another one, which is a common one that is asked, charter boat dives. So theoretically, the skipper, whilst not necessarily a BSAC dive leader, so not qualified to necessarily act as, or well, not dive leader, but a BSAC diver, not necessarily qualified to act as surface cover. The skippers are usually highly experienced people and can serve as surface cover. So, you know, you might be able to dive without official surface support. But when should we definitely not try and push that? So dives when you've got things like decompression or deep or long dives, anything with challenging conditions, and potentially rib dives as well. Why not rib dives? You shouldn't leave your rib unattended. Yeah, you shouldn't anchor up and then roll off it and then leave it there to the wind. Pirates could take it, or it could lose its anchor, and then you surface, you've got no boat, and then you've got no hope. So not a good idea. So this is all heavily caveated. You'll notice there was an asterisks on the when could we do it. This list is not definitive, so it's not something that you should say, Dave said this, I can definitely do that. It needs a thorough risk assessment and it needs approval from your diving officer before you do something like that. But it is a possibility, so it's something that you can bear in mind. Now, another element of your diving plan that you should think about is risk assessment. So why do we do a risk assessment? What is a risk assessment? Well, first of all, why? It helps inform our emergency action plan. So it helps us plan around what could go wrong. We identify those risks and then we can sort of work out how we're going to deal with them. So how do we do this? Well, we score those risks. So we score them usually by likelihood and then the impact. So how likely is that thing to happen? And then if it did happen, how bad's it going to be? Then on a risk assessment, it's not just a case of identifying what the risks are. We also want to talk about what we're going to do to control that risk. So we call that the control, and then we might also put in there additional mitigation. Now, I've got here a risk assessment that I did for a project dive. This one's a little bit left field because it's actually a project dive in Australia. So there's things like beware of overhangs, so lionfish in the overhangs, avoid walking barefoot in shallows. That's going to help you avoid the risk, which is stings, bites, and envenomations. But what else could we do as additional mitigation? So keep a supply of vinegar and antihistamines in the first aid kit. You might not have those in a dive first aid kit if you were diving Stony Cove. You wouldn't expect to get jellyfish sting in Stony, would you? So this is why I say the kit should always be appropriate to the dive that you're doing. Okay, so that's a risk assessment. Now, it's a running theme throughout this. Elements of a risk assessment can be recycled, but you need to be familiar with them. Don't just copy and paste risk assessments blithely from other members of your club. You need to know what's in them and what they are about. Because, as I said, they inform the emergency action plan. So these are almost unique for every plan. They should always be slightly different because you've got different people, different levels of skill available to us. What should they contain as a very basic level? Well, we've got emergency service contacts, nearest hospitals, chambers, procedures, but they may contain, as well as that, details for different scenarios and actions. So what you might do in the event of a missing diver, overdue divers, DCI, traumas. And one that I've underlined here, because it is quite important, is landing casualties. So how are you going to get people back onto shore in the event of an emergency? That's important for the surface cover, isn't it? How are they, if they see someone waving out in the shallows, desperate for help, what are they going to do? They're going to go charging in, or what equipment do they need to grab to effect a rescue? So it's really important that we do think about those. So I've got back to Australia. Actually, we've got an emergency action plan here from that same expedition plan I put in place. So you can see here there's a map. So it's got a picture of all the hospitals on it. Then it talks about where the recompression chamber is, and we've talked about diver recall procedure on this one. So how we're going to call the divers back if there's an emergency. So that's a good example. So that's your emergency action plan. That's risk assessment. Now, other things that we need to plan around and risks that we need to plan around, your what ifs. So what if we've got bad weather? or we've got equipment failure or dropouts. We need a plan for everything really. So things that we might want to plan in advance. So a backup site, where are we going to go if the weather turns on us? If there's a change in wind and waves. So that might be we dive in a different part of the coast or in a sheltered cove, or it might be we have to abandon diving in the ocean altogether and take it inland. You also might want to think about shelter. So if you do get a sudden squall that catches you unawares and you've managed to get everyone back on the boat, where could you go that's quite close? That sort of thing. Or also, where might you go to have your lunch? You know, shelter and things like that. If it has gone a bit rubbish. Backup plans, spares and repairs. So we've talked about that in the emergency kit. So having a backup set of a full backup of scuba equipment is useful. And another good one to think about, if you can and you have the luxury, is gas replacement. So what happens if you get a leaky tank on the drive to the dive site or to the coast? Have you got a spare tank, or is there somewhere that you can fill it up? And then last but not least, adapting the plan for different dive buddies. So what happens if someone rings you up the day before the dive and says, "Oh, I'm really sorry, Dave. I'm feeling a bit crook. I can't dive," and you say, "Okay, no worries, I've got someone on the waiting list." Now you've got to have think about juggling buddy pairs around and things like that, because the person that's cried in sick may have been an advanced diver, and then the person who's coming to take their place may just be an ocean diver. So have you got all the stuff in place that you need to allow that person to dive? So having those contingencies will make things run a lot smoother on the day. Now, getting through it, I've got another one of my fantastic animations. So this is to demonstrate diving in waves. Now, hopefully, diving in waves is a fairly simple concept, but I'm aware that some people have trouble getting their head around this, or at least it appears evident that some people do in the way that they do their planning. Now, this is a solution to what happens if you've got 4 divers, or 4 or more divers, and no one wants to sit on the beach all day watching them. So you've got no dedicated surface cover, so your surface cover wants to dive as well. So we need to factor this into our timelines. So it might take twice as long to dive, or it might take an extra hour to dive each wave. But how is it going to work? So here we go. We've got dive buddy pair number 1, and we've got dive buddy pair number 2. So we'll call pair number 1 first wave and pair number 2 second wave. And we are going to equip, these aren't aqualungs that I've just put on them, they are binoculars. It's the best thing I could find icon-wise to demonstrate it. But yeah, they are equipped with some binoculars, and now they're going to watch as buddy pair number 1, look at that animation, fabulous. They're going to watch them going into the water and doing their thing. Down they go. They're watching the bubbles. All right, they're using MAP methodology, if you remember from last week. Monitor, assess, predict, and plan. They're using MAP methodology and keeping an eye on them. And then up they come, bloop, and then the first wave makes their way back to land. While they're drying off, second pair gets their kit all set up. They hand over their binoculars, and then in they go. In the meantime, first wave, now having got out their kit, are now going to be keeping an eagle eye with their pink laser vision on the other 2 divers in the water. So there they go, down they go, watching the bubbles, using MAP, and then back up they come. Everyone's happy, safe as houses. Brilliant. That is diving in waves in a nutshell. Now you can make this as complicated and as fancy as you want. You can have multiple people in different waves. You can have different boats with different waves and all sorts of jazz. The concept remains the same. You need to have someone staying on the surface watching at all times, and then ideally let that person dive at some point. Okay, so that's diving in waves. Let's go on to something, the sort of difficulty level of high for dive planning, and this is boat diving. So boat diving, just by its nature, is a lot more complicated. It requires a lot more planning. Your own club might have its own guidance and things like that on how planning is conducted, which is good. But as a rule, start simple with a bit of help, build your experience, get competent, and try and work with the boat officer on this. It's going to be really difficult to do this without their support. So we've got some considerations. So one of the biggest considerations with boat diving is the logistics. So how is the boat going to get there? So we've got things like towing vehicles, drivers and assistants, because trying to hitch up a boat on your own isn't the easiest thing in the world. Towing law, so you need to be mindful of that. We've got launch and recovery operations, and we've got route planning. So you can see there in front of you a little excerpt. This is a passage planner or a route card. And it gives the waypoints to get from, if you can just about make it out there. Okay. Oops, no, there it is. So you've got the boat ramp, which is there, and then you've got the route, which is following that line out to the dive site, and then there's the reverse. So you could program that in advance into your GPS if you've got a fancy GPS. But these are important things that you'd need to do. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because there is a course that will cover all of this, and it's chart work and position fixing. It's a really worthwhile course. Look at the picture of those two individuals. They are smiling and happy. I've never seen such smiley, happy people doing chart work, but it is a fun course. I'd encourage you to have a go at it, and it'll give you some really useful tools and methodologies for doing it. Now, other things that you need to think about when we are diving on a boat. So we've talked about the tide already. So we've got the diveable window, which is kind of important, but also something that some people do forget. And I know certain other university clubs that will remain nameless that have found themselves in hot water because of this, and that is launch and recovery constraints. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've got another animation. Oh, you lucky devils. So here it is. So you've launched your boat and you're in this position now. You've got plenty of water under you, which is good. But then what? Okay, day progresses and then the water falls away. Now, first thing that you might notice is you got a big jagged rock sticking up there. If you try and now drive your boat up towards the ramp, you're going to hold the bottom of it. You're going to put a big nasty gouge in the bottom of the boat and it's going to sink and you're going to have a bad time. So that's a problem in itself. Another logistical problem, depending on the ramp that you're talking about, is they don't always extend to deep depths in the sea. So if you see there's quite a sharp lip at the bottom of that ramp. Let's reverse our truck down and then boom, the wheels go over the edge of the lip, and then you might not even notice that that's happened, but first of all, you've probably damaged the brake system on the trailer if it's braked, but also you load the boat onto it, which is fine, and then you try and pull the boat back out, and you're going to tear the wheels off the trailer, and then you're going to have a really bad time then. So that's a really important consideration. It's one that you talk about in chart work and position fixing, and also it's part of boat handling, which is another course that you can do. Okay, so let's talk about some more considerations with boats. This is why boat diving is really challenging to get your head around at first. Other things to think about: you've got consumables and costs, so thinking about that. So how are you going to pay for fuel? Have you got enough fuel for the boat and the towing vehicles? Towing vehicles, they tend to use a lot more fuel when they are pulling a boat behind them. You need to know the routes that the boat's going to be taking, so calculate roughly how much fuel you're going to be using, and also the route that the vehicle's going to be traveling, the towing vehicle. You're not going to be able to drive nice and efficiently on the motorways necessarily, so that sort of thing is something you consider. You got slip fees, so all of those costs and consumables that you're going to need to sort of work out and divvy those up, aren't you? So you might have a costs section in your plan. Other considerations, so you've got additional equipment like the engine and the nav and comms systems, so all the faff on the boat. So do you need to go a couple of days before and just run the engine up and make sure it's running? Do you need to make sure that the navigation and communications equipment are all working? Ideally, you don't want to get to a dive site and find out that they're kaput. And then on emergencies, well, there's a lot more eventualities that you need to think about with regards to this. So a lot more planning involved, a much more in-depth risk assessment, and potentially a lot more equipment. You also need to think in a lot more detail about that O2 gas planning. So you need to be calculating how long it's going to take to get people out the water and then back to the shore, and do those calculations that I mentioned earlier in the session. So, and John's just put in a link there, which I watched this the other day. It's really useful. Launching and recovering a boat. There's a video there in the chat. I'd advise you to have a quick look. It's not too long as well. I think it was only about sort of 20 odd minutes, so it's quite a concise one. Not like me and my rambling lectures. But the good thing is that we are almost done. So I'd like you guys to shout out in the chat now. See if you can remember what elements of what are the elements of a diving plan. So what sort of headings, if you were going to make a plan now, what sort of headings would you want to be covering? So who, what, when, where, yeah. Who, what, when, where, how's, timings. So timings, that's a good one. Travel. Nick says why. Well, I think we all know why we want to do things. We want to go diving, don't we? We've got the risk assessment. Yeah, that's a useful one. We've got emergency or surface cover. Anything else? Training to be done. That's a useful one. I've not really covered that today, Ben. But yeah, training. For me, a training plan would be something that you'd discuss with the training officer. If you were doing training, it'd be like an annex to the dive plan, but it's still useful. Yeah, so we've got emergency numbers. That's part of the who's and the what's. We've got next of kins. Yeah. All right, so I think we've pretty much. Oh yeah, have we got equipment? No, we've not got equipment. Okay, so we've got loads of stuff there. Oh, Tony's mentioned make sure flares are in date. Yeah, always good advice. And then dispose of them safely if you do find that they aren't in date anymore. All right, so that's really good. We've covered a lot of what I'm about to cover on this next slide, and you'll be glad to know we're nearly there now. So here's an example of a detailed plan, and for those of you who are interested, I can put a link to an example of a detailed plan that you can take away. It's part of something that I've been working on for First Class Diver. And this is a really expansive plan. It covers loads of detail, perhaps a little bit more than you might need to. So let's have a look at the areas that we're covering. So we've got objectives, so the whys, outline plan, a bit more why. We've got the divers and the surface cover, so the who's. Then we've got the equipment. So this is the what's, isn't it? So this you should recognise from the other slide. And I've got mention of diving gas. So where we're going to get fills. So that's a little bit of backup plan there, isn't there? Then we've got transport to the site, what the boats are, transit times, and site locations. We've got some tidal tables there, a couple of different sources, and we've got weather forecasts. Okay, so all screen grabs there that I've done. We've got dive management. So how are we going to do it? So we're going to be logging on a slate. We're going to do briefings. We're going to do debriefings. And then we've got a rough plan that people should try to adhere to, the maximum plan that they should be doing. Obviously, they can do something less risky or more conservative, whatever. We talk about decompression and planning around that. We've got some information on run times. So this is a project dive that we're doing there. So we've got lots of divers trying to do the same thing. So this is a guess on a run time. And then this is quite an important part, the adapting the plan. So what happens if things go slightly untoward? So what happens if we don't have much time on slack? Suddenly we find strong currents. Or what if we get to the dive site and the buoy line's missing? What do we do then? And then finally, we've got all the annexes. I've not included all the annexes because there's lots of them, but you could include anything. You might have bits about fish. You might have, details about the project itself or useful information. But in this case, Annex D contains some route cards. So how are we going to get to the places? So it'd be remiss of me if I didn't mention again where next. What could you do now? Assuming that you're all nearing or at least halfway through your dive leader, what can you do? Where can you go with this? So we can do the courses that I mentioned, those two skill development courses, belt handling and chart work. And once you finish dive leader, another option is to crack on and start working towards advanced diver, which is where all of this really comes into its own. So I've pinched a quote from someone from the University of Nottingham off the BSAC website. Helen says, as an advanced diver, my diving and planning skills have been extended. I can now confidently plan and manage adventurous expeditions. That's the key, isn't it? It's the adventurous part. Instead of just planning a dive to Stony Cove, you can be planning a dive to, wherever, Timbuktu, somewhere really, really interesting. Although Timbuktu is in the middle of the desert, isn't it? But yeah, the point remains. It's a really worthwhile endeavour to do, and I'd encourage you to try it. So here we go. Summary. We're on the home straight. So what I want you guys to take away from this. So there was no knowledge objectives in this. This was me trying to give you a bit of a kick up the backside to try and push you to do some dive planning. We can all do it. Don't be put off. It is a rewarding experience. It's really beneficial. Like I said, it gives you a bit more control and a bit more freedom to do the types of diving that you want. So what else have we covered? So I've hopefully given you an insight into the different levels that you can go to in planning. So you should feel empowered now to at least go and crack on with the simple one. Hopefully you do. Or dare say maybe intermediate and complex types of dive plan. But the important thing is, like with any type of diving skill or any skill in life, walk before you run. So start simple, build up on those successes, and gain confidence from those. And I keep harping on about this, the considerations, different plan for different dives, okay? You need to make sure that whatever you're planning is appropriate, and that you've thought about it for each session that you're planning. It's not sufficient to just copy and paste plans. So please don't get into the habit of doing that. So that is the end of the session. What I'm going to do now is have my usual battle with the turn off recording button. Success, I think. Come on, let me stop. No, it's still doing it again.